The growing tension between the Asian immigrants to the United States and the Americans in the late 19th century roused debate about the issue of the most diplomatic approach to the rising problem of immigration to America. In the mid-19th century, people of Asian descent began immigrating to the United States in search of gold. The California gold rush had begun. At first, the Chinese were treated fairly, but as time progressed, the Americans and other miners became less and less fond of the successful Chinese. The American miners would often instigate violence with the Chinese, and these raucous debates often concluded with both parties injured or even dead. After the gold rush, many Chinese found work on the Transcontinental Railroad. However, after these ventures, the white settlers began immigrating west and were less than accommodating. As these minor debates became more and more frequent, Congress composed a bill to stop Chinese immigration. At first, President Chester Arthur tried to fight the bill, and Congress was unable to override the veto. However, the bill was pushed through, and he signed it on May 6, 1882, ratifying the Chinese Exclusion Act. As stated in the preamble of the Chinese Exclusion Act,
in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities,
expressing the view the government had on the immigrants. This act made it so that Chinese labor immigrants could not enter the United States for a 10-year period of time, with reasons being that the immigrants endangered the well-being of certain areas. Certain exceptions were made to the act in order to keep diplomatic relations with China. One such exception was that, for a period of 90 days after ratification, the Chinese immigrants that were coming into the country were to be allowed to stay. This policy was put in place because of the time that it took to get news across the Pacific. The only Chinese that were able to get into the United States after the passage of this act were the Chinese diplomats, and even they had to have legal documents certifying that they were indeed government officials. Either that, or they would have to have some kind of proof that they were, in fact, coming into the country legally. However, there were still many people that didn't meet these requirements. These people were the average Chinese attempting to get into the United States because of the harsh conditions in China. This created an underground market for coaching books. These books were sold to people trying to enter the country and contained information about people who were already living there. Since one of the exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Acts was that immediate family of someone already in the United States could enter America, these people, assuming the identity of such relatives, were able to enter the United States. When someone purchased a coaching book, they would memorize all of the information in it, and upon their arrival, they would be interrogated by the United States Customs Office. These coaching books were disposed of immediately after memorization to avoid the discovery of such a document. The interrogations these people went through were incredibly grueling and redundant. On the other hand, there were already many Chinese in America. A large percentage of the Chinese population in America lived in California, many of which had come during the gold rush. Section 5 of the Exclusion Act states that any immigrants that were already in the United States before the passing of the act were eligible to receive a certificate that would allow them to leave the country and come back. There was much debate concerning the legitimacy of these documents. American-born Chinese also had this right, although technically, under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, those born in the United States were legal citizens. The passing of the act was a tough decision for Congress to make. Many people living in the western United States felt that the Chinese laborers were affecting the economy, debating that the arrival of the laborers caused a recession in the United States economy, although it was only a coincidence. As president, Chester A. Arthur had to choose what was good for America, and after much debate and time, he passed the act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not the only debated policy directed towards the Chinese, however. The earliest policies, in the 1850s, demanded taxes and other fees of Chinese laborers immigrating to find work. Some policies extended far after the passage of the act. The foreign miners' license tax required a payment of $3 each month from all foreign miners who were not United States citizens, targeting Chinese miners. Other taxes like this targeted specific areas where Chinese workers, or coolies, often took work positions. Some of the more controversial acts, like the Q Ordinance, were specifically directed towards the Chinese traditions and culture. This act required the Chinese men to cut off their queues, which were traditional braids worn by Chinese men as a symbol of their loyalty to China. As many of them planned to return to China, cutting this off would have been an act of extreme shame. The debate concerning the Chinese was not all political. On the streets of most California towns, Chinese people could not walk through without being ridiculed or insulted. The fear the Americans had of the coolies stealing their income was so real that many even went on riots, burning down the houses of Chinese and driving out anyone who remained. These racist policies put in place by the state of California and the United States did not go unchallenged, however. Many of these cases were taken to court, some of them all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Tate versus Hurley case of 1885 was a widely debated issue, having to do with a child's right to education. Mamie Tate was an 8-year-old girl of Chinese parentage. According to school district policy, the school was allowed to keep her from entering. Her father, Joseph Tate, believed that this was unconstitutional and proceeded to sue the school principal, taking his case to the Supreme Court of California. The fact of the matter was, Mamie had been born in the United States and had always been a United States citizen, a point he used in his debate with the Supreme Court. But, regardless of that fact, the school stated that the Chinese were a danger to the well-being of the state. Thus, the principal reasoned that they had no obligation to educate Mamie, let alone any other Chinese child. This contradicted the Education Code, Section 1667, which states that
every school, unless otherwise provided by law, must be open for the admission of all children between 6 and 21 years of age residing in the district.
In accordance with this code, the court decided in favor of the Tates. This case was the foundation for the later and more famous case of Brown versus Board of Education 69 years later in 1954. Another of these historic cases was United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This case had to do with the citizenship of an American man of Chinese descent. Wong Kim was born in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1873. The case was that the government denied him entry into the United States when he came back from a visit to China in 1895, on the sole ground that he wasn't a citizen. The basis for Wong's debate with Congress was that in 1894, he had left the United States and come back, yet this time, he was not allowed re-entry. The United States Supreme Court resolved this debate by stating,
"It is conceded that, if he is a citizen of the United States, the acts of Congress, known as the Chinese Exclusion Acts, prohibiting persons of the Chinese race from coming into the United States do not and cannot apply to him."
Wong Kim was allowed back into the United States, and this case became the grounds for the diplomatic resolutions of similar issues in United States history. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 roused much debate across the nation. Asian Americans that came to the United States experienced extreme racial prejudice, and it was nearly impossible to find a diplomatic solution to the issue that would please both parties. A long debate between Congress and the President ensued. The last racist policy was lifted in the year 1965. And finally, after about 100 years, the state of California debated that it was only diplomatic to apologize to all of the Chinese descendants of those who were persecuted so unjustly by our own ancestors in America. This poem embodies the hardship that these immigrants were subjected to.
没有强权不公理，并无误人也无乎？不有分数真长苦，俯首怀兮莫劳活。
America has power, but no justice. In prison, we were victimized, as if we were guilty, given no opportunity to explain. It was truly brutal. I bow my head in reflection, but there is nothing I can do.